Lorraine Avenue Mennonite Church, welcome to worship this beautiful mid-September afternoon. It is a risk to have come to worship today. This is a place where believers worship what cannot be seen, choose to participate in a living mystery, and try with all the Spirit's help to allow transformation in their lives, the church, and the world. This is a place where believers try with all the Spirit's grace to risk letting go of familiar but stubborn ways in order to believe, receive, and love anew. Please join with me in the call to worship in your bulletin. Come, hear this together. Come, listen to these words about a God of love. Come, learn of friends standing strong among the pressure to conform. Come, worship, worship, serve, and delight in our God.
We have stories.
The opening hymn. Please stand. We have the time for children. There's Christina. Oh, good.
And maybe just us two, Hassan. We get a whole bunch of young people out here. There you go. So, and I think we have some people possibly also joining us by Zoom. So we'll tell a bit of our story here. So I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago that your grandma, Kathy Everingham, was talking about would you rather, right? Some stories about her father and choices he had to make during the period of World War II, when he decided that he was going to be, he had to make a decision about whether or not he was going to go into the army, or if he was going to go with civilian public service, which a lot of other Mennonite young men at his age were choosing to do as well, which was a choice that he made, right? When I was growing up, I heard a lot of these stories. I think I've shared some of them with you as well. But one of the stories I think that you remember well is the story of your own grandfather, of Grandpa Doug, right? And the choices that he made at a time when men were being sent off, well, young men again, really, were being sent off to war again. This would have been during the Vietnam War. And Grandpa, he actually did go into the National Guard, but then he said, you know what, I'm not going to shoot a gun, right? That was against his principles. He said, other people's lives matter too. And not just American lives, right? All lives matter in this case. So, in this case, I think I can say that here. And I think one of the things that I have learned from listening to these stories was about making choices that maybe were not popular, and that people had to make for themselves, right? And that their choices were based in their belief system and the faith that they held. Would you agree with that? And so I have not had to make any choice like that in my lifetime. Nothing anywhere near that. Part of it too is as a woman, when I turned 18, I did not have to make any choice about signing up for the selective service. There is a choice that you will have to make when you get to that age about whether that is something that you will do and how you will go about it if you do make that choice. I know as your mom, I have a lot of apprehension, a lot of fear around what that means for you and the faith and the choices that you've made for yourself. But I really think that a lot of these stories have contributed to the choices that you'll make when you get to that point. One of the things that I have made a decision about, and that risked a whole lot less than Grandpa Doug or Grandpa Menno, was a very simple one. Was every day when I went to school, when I was growing up, they always would say the Pledge of Allegiance in class. And one of the things that I learned in the church that I was going to when I was growing up, I went to Church of the Servant, another Mennonite church here in Wichita, was that God loved every single person, that all people, not just Americans, but every single one was made in God's image. And that the love that God had was for all people and not just one group of people. And so it was something that I made a decision about very young. I remember in first grade was, I think, at least that's my recollection of when I first made a decision not to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. And some years I had teachers who just, looked past it, didn't make a big deal about it. I had kids who might give me some, raised eyebrows. Other years I've had teachers who actually took me out of a class and berated me for my choices. One of those teachers, Linda Niles, she was a teacher that I had in East High. She's still a friend of mine now. And that first time that I did, she had already met some of our exchange students that we had living with us. And so when she took me out and told me, that I needed to stand in her classroom, I told her that the reason that I didn't was because there were so many people around the world that we recognized as members of our family. Not just by blood, not just by national origin, but these are individuals and then groups of people that were connected to us all over the world. And I think that really, it mattered to her. She understood. And later on, it's something that we've had a conversation about since then. I wanted to kind of ask you about your first recollection of when you had to make that choice. I know when we talked in the car on the way here, you said you don't remember that first time. But I know you've heard us talk about what you've said when you had to make that choice. So can I pass it off to you and you can tell a little bit about that?
So, back in kindergarten, wait, it was in kindergarten. My teacher, Mr. Kirkman, I don't know. So I had made the decision not to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, and I don't remember why I told him, but what I told him was that I think that everyone is equal, and to say that one nation above all others is not fair to everyone else. And that kind of hit home with me because my dad's Hispanic, so it's like important to me that everyone is treated equally.
I just remember Mr. Kirkman called me that first day of school and said that he'd never had a student who had not chosen to do the Pledge of Allegiance and then was able to explain, what his reasoning was. And he was so impressed by that. I think we've also talked a little bit about the fact that we also believe that other people's beliefs are important, even if they don't match with ours, right? One of the things that we discussed on the car ride again on the way here was that it's been different for you in high school. Can you tell a little bit about what it's been like in your high school class and how that's different?
So, since starting high school, almost none of the kids stand. But one thing that I don't think is fair is that a lot of the kids who don't stand end up talking during the Pledge of Allegiance. And I think that that's disrespectful to the people who do want to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. They shouldn't be talking and just disrespecting people who do stand.
Yeah, I think you also mentioned there was a student who wanted to stand and didn't feel comfortable doing so. So I think one of the things that we discussed is that it's so important both for us to take the stand, but also to respect other people's beliefs as we do so. And that conformity is not what we're looking for here, but rather following what our faith is and respecting others in their faith. Is that well? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Now it's time for our tithes and offerings in the service. And usually we'd pass a plate, but we haven't been doing that. Maybe we'll get back to doing that before too long. If you have something you brought with you to bring, there's a box in the back that you can put your offering in. Let's pray. God of abundance, all the things we have were yours before they were ours. Your gifts to bring us joy and to meet our need. Let them become our gifts to others and to bring them joy and meet their need. May we live so that others may have what we have for Jesus' sake. Amen. We'll sing. Stand if you're able, please. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord let King Jehoiakim of Judah fall into his power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. These he brought to the land of Shinar and placed the vessels in the treasury of his gods. Then the king commanded his palace master, Ashpenaz, to bring some of the Israelites of the royal family and of the nobility, young men without physical defect and handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the king's palace. They were to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the royal rations of food and wine. They were to be educated for 3 years, so that at the end of that time they could be stationed in the king's court. Among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the tribe of Judah. The palace master gave them other names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the royal rations of food and wine. So he asked the palace master to allow him not to defile himself. Now God allowed Daniel to receive favor and compassion from the palace master. The palace master said to Daniel,
I am afraid of my lord the king. He has appointed your food and your drink. If he should see you in poorer condition than the other young men of your own age, you would endanger my head with the king.
Then Daniel asked the guard whom the palace master had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah.
Please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. You can then compare our appearance to the appearance of the young men who eat the royal rations. And then you can deal with your servants according to what you observe.
So he agreed to this proposal and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was observed that they appeared better and fatter than all the young men who had been eating the royal rations. So the guard continued to withdraw their royal rations and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and skill in every aspect of literature and wisdom. Daniel also had insight into all visions and dreams. At the end of the time that the king had set for them to be brought in, the palace master brought them into the presence of Nebuchadnezzar, and the king spoke with them. And among them all, no one was found to compare with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they were stationed in the king's court. In every matter of wisdom and understanding concerning which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel continued there until the 1st year of King Cyrus.
Thank you, and good afternoon. And would you look at that? Another biblical reason to be vegetarian. Isn't that neat? Only mostly joking. So the story of Daniel takes place after the fall of the kingdom of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar and his Babylonian empire come and take over the people of Judah and take the best of the best with them, leaving those who remain to fend for themselves. And as it happens, when many empires take over these smaller nations, they will take some of the best of those best of the best and bring them into their courts to try to get them to assimilate to their ways, to help the rest of the people see that this is the way to be as you are being occupied and colonized by a new empire. And if I had more time, the thing I would really also like to talk about is that in Hebrew, Ashpenaz is referred to as being the chief of the eunuchs. Fancy that. And so if we make a little connection, so eunuchs were sexual minorities of their time. And if he is the chief of these 4 boys, they would have been given under his care and probably would have been made to be eunuchs and therefore sexual minorities, which means this is a very queer story. Daniel, Rakshak, and Benny, they're all queer. And I will admit I don't have time to talk about that. There are other things I want to talk about, but that's a really cool piece of this story that I think is really important. Today, I want to focus on the thing that many people focus on when we talk about this story, and that is the food. I love food. There are a number of theories about why these 4 young men would have refused this food. 2 of my favorites are that it was very common for Jewish people at that time to refuse meat that had been sacrificed to false idols. And in these large kingdoms, the king would offer his food first to his idols or his gods, and then would spread the food out to everyone else, giving himself the best of the best. And upholding these traditions was vitally important for especially minority communities in diaspora, or who have been spread out, whether willingly or not, into places that is not their homeland. It's sort of like when you send your kids off to college and you worry that maybe they will lose faith, or maybe they will not do things quite the way you had taught them to do. And so for Daniel and his friends, they saw it as vitally important to keep with the ways of their people while they were in exile in Babylon. My favorite theory, however, is that by accepting King Nebuchadnezzar's food, it was accepting a relationship with Nebuchadnezzar, or Nebuchadnezzar as VeggieTales calls him. It's sort of this hospitality law, or and so I think this is why Ashpenaz, the king, or the guard dude, was so nervous at first, because these 4 boys were refusing the king's hospitality and asking for something different. This could have been seen as a slap in the face. And I wonder if that's not why everything was kind of quiet at first. Daniel and his friends, they stood firm, and ultimately that was the correct choice for them. They were fatter and healthier than the others who were eating the meat and drinking the wine. And this leads me to remember a phrase I wonder if you have heard in the past. This quote is, "Kill the Indian to save the man." This quote is attributed to General Richard Henry Pratt, who lived in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Pratt is said to have spearheaded or championed the cultural assimilation or cultural genocide of the indigenous populations of this country. Laws were put in place that restricted indigenous folks from practicing their religions. It forced many of them onto reservations where they did not have what they needed to survive. It set up the residential schools that were put in place to Anglicanize or to make white the indigenous people and rob these children of their culture for generations. The First Amendment of the US Constitution, or the freedom of religion, had a very large appendix that explicitly excluded indigenous peoples from practicing their faith traditions. And did you know, I learned this week that it was not until Jimmy Carter in 1978 passed the American Indian Religious Freedom Act that these humans were able to practice their faith traditions. I think this is what Nebuchadnezzar is doing. He wants to rob the Jewish people of their culture and their ways to convince them that the Babylonian way is the best way or the right way of doing things, so that they will assimilate better and not cause problems to his empire. And Daniel and his friends say, no, we do not accept. And that is not to say that the indigenous people of this continent didn't say no or resist, because they absolutely did in a number of ways. I just want to lightly draw that comparison, especially because Daniel and his friends, in the end, ultimately were right. That way was the better way of doing things for them. Which leads me to what I want to actually talk about, and that is climate change. Climate change is on my mind almost constantly these days. In my reading about climate change, as I'm doom scrolling on the social medias, I found out that indigenous action has led to a global carbon emission reduction. I said that really weird. Indigenous people have helped to lower the carbon emissions of the world by 25%. Now, this includes things like indigenous managed lands and forests, so offsetting carbon that is being put out or not allowing that land to be used for agricultural farming or deforestation. This also includes direct action and activism against laws and pipelines and things of that nature. And it includes having laws and plans changed. So offsetting possible outcomes like deforestation and their direct actions. And knowing all of this, I have to wonder, what would have happened if we had just listened to them? What would our world be like if we had taken the advice of the stewards of this continent hundreds of years ago on how to take care of this continent, this planet? I think about Standing Rock and how they held strong for months, if not years, and they delayed the Keystone XL pipeline. They said that it would leak and pollute their water. And wouldn't you know it, less than 2 years later, it spilled almost 400,000 gallons of crude oil into their waterways. What if we had listened? Currently, in Minnesota, there's another Standing Rock taking place, Line 3. Action is being taken by Indigenous folks and their allies to put a stop to Line 3. Line 3 breaks treaties put in place by the federal government, not that the federal government is great at listening to their own treaties with the Indigenous peoples. It breaks treaties with the Anishinaabe people who are stewards of that land. It endangers the untouched wetlands of that area. And almost exactly the same thing is happening in Michigan, in Michigan with Line 5. One of the things that makes me the most nervous is that during a global pandemic, our world shut down for about 5 or 6 months where we hard shut down and our emissions plummeted. And we still experienced record-breaking storms and temperatures, both in the positive and the negative. That makes me nervous. And what if we had listened to the Indigenous peoples eons ago or yesterday? You know, when the colonizers got here, when our ancestors arrived, the Indigenous peoples were unmatched in their medical knowledge of the plants of this continent. They had brain surgery. In the early thousands, they had brain surgery and their patients lived. Many tribes were matrilineal. All of the big decisions were either made by or affirmed or blocked by the women in their communities because women were seen as having access to the future. They had found ways to peaceably work with and live with the earth rather than exploit it. And even in the American Southwest, or what is now the American Southwest, where there were cities with tens of thousands of people living together, they were sustainable. What if we had listened back then? What kind of a world could we live in? When left alone and not ransacked, our environment takes care of itself. When predators are poached by white men with guns so that they can take pictures next to corpses, the prey animals overpopulate and they decimate the plant life in an ecosystem. When early colonizers attempted to eradicate the bison population, intentionally to make things more difficult for the Indigenous peoples, the bison no longer cleared the prairies with their bodies, creating walkways and habitats for other animals that were smaller than them. This caused prairie fires to decimate areas. The predators that relied on the bison went extinct, and entire ecosystems were ruined purely because of the colonizers' hatred for the Indigenous people. Last week in her sermon, Christina talked about doing the next right thing. And that's something that has stuck with me this last week. And I've wondered what the next right thing for the environment might look like. What might the next right thing for our Indigenous populations look like? How do my actions affect the environment and the people around me? What about the global community that we're all a part of? Because our decisions so rarely only affect ourselves. Daniel and his friends were faithful to their calling and their faith. As we continue on in Daniel's story, we learn that he became an important advisor for multiple Babylonian rulers. His wisdom and dream interpretation was unparalleled. When the rulers follow Daniel's advice, good things happen not only for the Jewish people, but also for Babylon. As stewards of this earth, that is all of us who live on this earth, I wonder how we might strive to uphold its care to the level of importance that it requires, and the Indigenous voices that have been doing so for millennia. And so I will readily admit, I don't know what that means for me. or for us as Lorraine Avenue Mennonite Church, or I don't know explicitly all of the things that it means for me and us as a church. But I do have to wonder where we might go from here each day. I've been reading Braiding Sweetgrass recently, which is phenomenal and has been blowing my mind. So I highly recommend that book if you are a reader. I've been signing petitions and writing elected officials about line 3 and 5, and it never feels like enough. It never feels like enough. In the months that come, I hope to listen and act when and where I can. And I want to make sure that I ask the question, what and who am I listening to? And I offer that to you as well. What and who are you listening to? What new ideas have you come across that maybe make you feel uncomfortable or make you question a teaching you were given from the past? Because I have to wonder again and again, what would have happened if we had just listened? Amen. Friends, in the coming weeks, may God's presence rain down in your lives, and may it be met with a song like Mary's to cry out to God in gratitude for this change that the world is about to turn. Amen.